We're going to do a quick anatomy review to start things off, and I'm going to show you 6 examples of some specification workflows. I'm going to summarize then that detail that we saw in the 6 examples. I'll summarize that into the key design features that you saw today, some of the themes in those design approaches. Quick stop to talk about versions. You can version a workflow and kind of what the pitfalls and things to watch out for if you do create a workflow, use it for a period of time, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, whatever, and then want to change the workflow. That's called versioning the workflow. So workflow consists of stages. You can have as many as you want, and they are discrete. Stages are discrete, and they are your object that is passing through the workflow, in this case the specification, moves through those stages in a consecutive manner. Within a stage, there are steps. You can have more than one step per stage, and steps are simultaneous. So in my stage number 2 here, I have steps A and B. Step B could occur before step A. If you can't control the order in which those steps are acted on, the people that are responsible for those steps both have opportunities to work, and so you just want to make sure that the work can happen simultaneously, not consecutively. If you need tasks to happen consecutively, you need to put those into different stages. So if you're picturing a brick wall between stages, the way the specification moves through or across that brick wall is through a transition action. So the actors, the people permissions, they are listed below here. The actors are attached to a step, and they engage with transition actions. When they have completed their task, they invoke their appropriate transition action, and that moves the object from the stage, from their stage to the next stage. A word about these 3 ways to add people. This is one of the key confusing parts of workflow. Quickly in order, the first one, a simple user group. You create a user group, put 1 or more people in it, and everyone is asked to work on that task simultaneously. Number 2, assignment mapping. This is a feature that allows you to route that object to specific user groups based on a criteria. And for workflow, those criteria can be functional area, data system, or specification type. So for example, data system, if you have a data warehouse, a student ERP system, and a human resources system, you can route that specification for building to specific groups of people based on that data system. So that's what an assignment mapping does. It's an automatic mapping of automatic routing of that specification to a specific user group. Named role, think of this as person A assigns a task to person B. Typically this is person A is a manager and person B is a staff member who receives an assignment from their manager. So it allows for personalization. A conditional is a feature that can be enacted across the entire workflow. So if a certain condition is met, the workflow will be used. If the conditional is not met, the workflow will be skipped, and the second workflow is assumed. If you have a conditional workflow, it assumes that there's a second workflow for items that do not meet the condition. And so if the conditional is not met, the specification goes on to the next workflow and proceeds to traverse that second workflow. You can put a conditional on a step. I'm not going to talk about that in detail today. It's just too much detail, but I do need to mention it just to be honest about it. The conditionals available for specification workflows are same as for assignment mapping. You can conditional on the functional area, on the data system, or on the specification type, and we'll see an example of some conditionals on specification type. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of the pieces of a workflow. It's the same. I gave the same overview in the definition series. the features are the same, whether you're in definition or specification workflow. So an assignment mapping is created externally to your workflow. And we're going to take a look at, as I said, technical editors by data system. So I have about 5 in this demo account. And you can see on the left-hand side, there's all my data systems for this account. And here is the corresponding user group. So the specification, if it is assigned to this data system, the people in this user group, technical editors for my ERP system, would be able to receive the order, if you will, the request to build the report. I have this user group for my ERP system. I also have one for my LMS. Notice the rest I'm just using, I chose, for simplicity's sake, to just use a general user group. The folks who are skilled in writing reports off of this system, in my hypothetical example anyway, can all come from this general functional area user group. So you don't have to, you can repeat user groups in your mappings. So that's the administrative side of an assignment mapping. So you create it, and then when you build your workflow, you attach it to the workflow itself. You can reuse them in multiple workflows. Let's look at a named role to show you an example of what that structure looks like. Again, a named role is where person A selects person B to accomplish a task. We're going to look at a named specification assignee. And this was designed for a manager. So I just lost audio again.
Yep.
Is that better?
I think it's still soft.
Is that better?
No.
Is that? How's that?
It's getting worse, I think.
Ooh. How's that?
Yeah, I think that's good. Keep talking.
Better? Okay. All right. So this is illustrating how a group will be selected from as the report writers, and the group who will make the selection is the managers. So you've selected 2 user groups there. This is person A and this is person B. Okay. I just wanted to give you that a little bit more background on the structure of an assignment mapping and a named role. All right, let's now pivot over to some examples. Here's the example of the workflow that comes as default in your cookbook. So if you have not customized your workflow for specification, this is the workflow that is in use right now. And it goes like this. There's a request for the report through creating an initial creation of a specification. It goes to this in progress stage. Each of these circles represents a stage. From there, and then here the report is built and the specification is written. From the next stage is the item is returned back to the requester for their approval. And then they either approve it, they cancel it and change their mind, or they can return it back to the in progress to the people who were building it for more questions or for more iteration on the requirements. A lot is happening in this yellow circle there, that in progress, what's happening there, it is using what's called the named role. And the manager is receiving that initial request, assigns it to a worker who then proceeds to build it. And I'll show you what that looks like in the cookbook itself. If I need to be logged in as Dan Helper, so I'm going to log out and log in as Dan. Dan is the manager. And Dan would have gotten an email notification that told him there is something waiting for him to assign. In fact, it should appear, and I'm in his home area looking at his tasks, and we're going to take a look at this building capacity by floor detail. Jill created it earlier today, actually, and it's now Dan's job to assign that to somebody to work on it. So Dan can click directly to it from here. So this is illustrating kind of what the workflow looks like inside the cookbook itself. This is called the workflow panel. I'm going to open that up, and I can now see the details of how this workflow is operating and what my role is. I am able to make this assignment here, and I'm going to assign it to Myra. And so by my selecting her, I just kicked off an email to Myra saying, Myra, you've been requested to build a report around building capacity, and Myra would understand what that meant and would proceed to build the report. So that named role assignment happens pretty manually within the specification itself by the manager. Okay. I'm going to go back to the slides here. I also want to point out, before I go on, a feature that's true of all workflows, and that is this green, the difference between the green arrows and the gray arrows. The green arrows represent what we refer to at IData as the happy path, and that represents the path that the specification would traverse on its most efficient way to the approved state. Gray paths are called alternative paths, and they may not necessarily be bad things. In this case, sometimes they can go to canceled, but they can also be utilized to create an iterative, more of an agile design process between two groups of people. So you could iterate between Myra, who's now going to build the report, and Jill, who requested the report. Myra and Jill could iterate through a conversation through that as many times as they needed to. So those gray areas, even though they go back, as I said, they don't necessarily represent a bad thing. Okay, and the next slide is just a summary of the details there that'll be helpful to you maybe when you get the slide deck, some notes on what was happening in that previous slide spec picture. So the next one I want to show you is a workflow that was designed when the client, all they wanted to do was catalog a backlog of about 50 reports. And these reports were in use. They were hard. It was hard to discover. It was hard to see the entire set of them. So there was nothing to request. They already existed. And the client wanted to make that set of 50 reports discoverable and searchable. And so they documented those reports as specifications and used their Data Cookbook to provide that search engine and that discovery piece to their catalog of pre-existing reports. So a very simple workflow. The person who was doing that documentation was already quite familiar with the reports in question. There was nobody else that she needed to ask or check in with. She could start the specification, fill it out in its entirety, and approve it herself. So very simple, bare bones approach. And then there's the design details for it. This next example was for a client where I call it the split build with a smart requester. So this client had in their request process for reports, they had kind of an equal split with a bit more of traffic going to the BI in IT and the rest of it going to the IR to build, the Institutional Research Department to build. So both of these groups, and I think you're familiar with this structure, it's common, both of these groups could build reports, and the requester in this client's case was sophisticated enough to know which one they should route to. So the requester makes that designation. Let's say they choose the BI route. From there it would go, and then it would be built by staff and BI. After they were finished, there was a manager who would take a look at it, check for accuracy and consistency, etc. And then it would be sent back to the requester to check for did it meet their requirements, and then that requester would be the one who would indicate the approved state. Parallel path would happen if it went to institutional research. It goes to IR to build, it goes to the IR manager to approve, goes to the requester for approval, and then goes to the approved state. Something to note here is that you can only have one happy path exiting a stage. So in the drafting stage, I had to choose one of these two paths to be the happy path, and I opted for the BI one because it was slightly more frequent. IR got the alternate path message. Once it went to IR, though, it did have happy path. You can then pick up a happy path, and two happy paths can join into a stage, and then the single happy path exits out as the requester approves it. And there probably would be, the requester would probably be able to send it back. I just didn't, for simplicity's sake, I didn't include those arrows in this screenshot. I want to go back over to the to the demo account now and show you what that looks like, because it's interesting to see the workflow panel for that. And to do that, I need to look at, I want to be logged in as Jill, because she was the person who created the report. She was the creator. She was my sophisticated requester. And she knew those two departments. And she knew, based on what she needed in her report, she knew which one she should choose. So here it's this student athletes by major. If I open up the workflow panel, I can see the stages listed here. And Jill's choices are, if she wants to submit to BI, she goes there. If she wants to submit to IR, she's got to take a couple extra steps. The BI one is more prominent because, as you recall, it's the happy path exiting out of the drafting stage. So it's getting more prominence, and it's these BI manager that is also appearing in it's the BI path that is appearing here because it's assuming happy path. As soon as Jill says, I want it to go to IR, that path will change. Notice the color changes. Oh, I apologize. It does not. I was expecting that to change as the happy path changes. It did not. But her button still remains accurate for traversing that alternative non-happy path. I think what's important to point out in this is that sophisticated user needs to be able to know to dig for that submit to IR button, which is significantly quieter than submit to IR. So your sophisticated requester needs to be able to traverse that workflow. It also points out, when you design your workflows, you want to take a look at them from this perspective, from the user's perspective, the requester's perspective, so that you can gauge whether they're going to be able to follow it from the workflow panel. Okay. So in your choice of labeling, etc., and just an overall complexity, you want to keep that in mind. Okay. Okay. Let's go. So the rest of I made all the points I needed to make. Let's go look at the next one. This is a design where they felt in their community that the requester could not decide. Maybe their requester was a more casual data user, and they would just not know what to do. And so they gave a single path, although there's quite a bit of alternate paths here. The requester is really just able to, actually you can see that all the requester can do is go to functional user to build or to a cancellation. So the buttons for this requester are much simpler. It's the recipient here at the functional user builds, and this is using an assignment mapping, so it's routing that request by functional area to an expert in that functional area. They're going to make the call as to whether it's a report that they can handle or if it's better suited for IT. So the BI piece down here, the BI IT piece. So this person, the functional user report writer, is a small subset, so maybe it's 10 people, right, across your 10 business domains. You can execute a lot of control, you can exercise a lot of control and training over a group of 10 people, and they will be able to comfortably make that assessment as to whether it should go to IT or not. If they do decide to punt and give it to IT can continue to carry the ball, take it to a final review stage, and then from there it goes to approved. And if it stays in functional user builds, it goes to the same final review and then on to the approved state. So that dividing point is handled here by a functional report builder, not by the requester. And you can see there can be iteration in conversation between the IT folks and the functional folks. Okay. So that simplifies it for the requester. There's only one path. IR staff can reassign if needed. And in this case, it was very high, like 80% of the, I meant to say the functional there instead of IR, but 80% of the stuff was going to the functional. So that was the main happy path used. This is a variation on that internal decision making that we saw in the previous workflow. In this one, the specification is created. It's built in some way. I'm not going to go into the details of how it's built because the point I want to get to here is it's been built and the IR office is charged with a final review. Are the numbers accurate? Does it follow standards? Does it make sense? And they are charged with punting it, in some cases, on an ad hoc basis to a data governance group. So it's just a judgment call that IR staff is being asked to make here. And again, you have high control. An IR staff is going to be pretty small, and high control, high access, high ability to keep them trained appropriately so that they can consistently make that ad hoc call as needed. An example of when this might be useful is, let's say, around privacy. Maybe your organization is just now starting to focus on privacy. And you don't want to formally put everything through a privacy review at this point. But your data governance group wants to start taking a look at it. And so this little, sometimes I call it the caboose, this opportunity of creating a sidestep over to a data governance review can be a nice way to bring in the governance group on a more casual basis to give them some visibility into the report request process. And then, of course, from there, the governance group could go to approved as well as the IR could go to approved as well. And the points here were just that IR staff it's easy to train them to make that appropriate ad hoc decision. Oh, I wanted to point out the requester doesn't approve. Notice that. So it goes from, there was no requester review, I think because they felt that the requester didn't want to be burdened with it. So they simply delivered it at this approved state at the end. Okay. Okay. Last example I want to show is a client who repurposed or really was intentional of how they used specification type, and they created 4 workflows, 1 for each specification, and they put a conditional on each one. And their situation was that the type of report, they wanted a different approval process depending on what type of report it was. I'll give you a summary here. Here are actually 5 spec reports. We're going to throw out ODS view. They did have to create that because it takes a completely separate path and is irrelevant to our conversation here. But these remaining 4, ad hoc, cross-department, department, and role or position specific. Purpose of ad hoc was just an individual person was just kind of experimenting with data. They just kind of wanted a one-off, not really maybe sure what they wanted in a final report. It's kind of a casual request for data. Low maintenance, low need for approval, or low need for sophisticated approval. Department use. This required the manager, so it was data within a department, staying within the department for usage, and they wanted the manager of that department to have the final approval of it. Probably a report that's going to endure, but still used within a very defined group of people. Oh, I skipped over cross-departmental use. Sorry about that. Cross-departmental is data from multiple domains and the report itself being used across multiple domains. Needs a high level of oversight, higher risk of confusion, misinterpretation, And so there was a governance group, actually, is the approver and the reviewer of reports that are assigned the cross-department use spec type. That's the highest, most weighty review process. The last one, role or position specific use, also has the requester as the approver. But the role of the requester is different. This was set up so that if you played a certain administrative role, such as a provost, or you were the assistant provost for global engagement, or you were the registrar, in that role, what set of reports were you supposed to be looking at, or what was available to you? So it's position specific. And the assumption being that that person in that role would be the approver of that content and of that report design. So it's requester approved, just like ad hoc was requester approved, but these role-based report types were much more enduring, and was something you would inherit as you came into a position. So those were the 4 different spec types. And I showed you one of the workflows. Here's the other 3. They are the same, really, in their design. What differs is in this the groups assigned in this final stage, whether you're the manager, the governance group, the role, or the just ad hoc requester. They needed to put different people at the end of that, at the bottom, as assigned to that stage. And he didn't want to burden the workflow with having that be manually chosen, right? And those other caboose examples we saw, a person could manually toss it to the right place, but it's a large school, and he wanted to automate that to reduce error and to just reduce burden on the staff. So he created these specification types, created 4 workflows so that he could control that approval based on those criteria. Okay. Let's take a look at, I wanted to take a step back and talk about the first part of the workflow, which is the request process. There's a lot of variability that you can take advantage of in this process, and I'll go through these 3 scenarios. The first one is that the client has a pre-existing ticketing system for the data request process. It's 5 years old. Everybody knows how to use it. It works really well, and I advocate, don't fix what isn't broken. So keep using that ticketing system and use something like that, the very simple spec workflow design I talked about earlier, which is simply a catalog of your existing reports, kind of after the fact, after they have already been created. Fair enough when you've got a well-functioning, popular ticketing system. Second scenario is maybe you got more than one ticketing system. It's kind of a mess. It's hard to know which one to use for what. Maybe some people, 30%, 40%, submit their requests through personal email. So it's a scattered, fragmented request process. You can use the cookbook to start to rein all that in. So you put an interface, so those ticketing systems continue to exist, and the people on the receiving end of those tickets, or on the receiving end of those emails, when they get that request, they turn to the cookbook and manually re-enter that request information into the cookbook as a specification. So they start here with this yellow point. So the original requester isn't touching the cookbook. So as a proxy, their request is entered in. The proxy person can swap out the name of the requester. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Or they can keep their own name throughout it, but you can swap out to the original requester. And then that report is built through this streamlined process. So the client begins to get a grip on a standardization of how the report is created and then ultimately delivered. But they still don't, this part over here to the left, that ticketing system, that initial request system is really kind of, they allow it to continue to be messy for a little bit longer. And first step, instead of boiling the ocean, first step is just to start to consistently deliver in the same manner across multiple intake points, for example. Let's take a quick look over so I can show you what that looks like in the cookbook, how you can swap out the name, act as a proxy, and then swap out somebody else's name. And I need to be logged in here as, who do I need to be logged in as? I need to be logged in as Jill. I am logged in as Jill. So let's go to Jill's homepage and look at her tasks. And I'm going to focus on a report called Enrollment Dashboard. There it is. So Jill just recently created this as a proxy for someone else, for George. George was the original requester. She can open up her workflow and she can swap out George's name for hers. So she's now made George the requester. And Jill is going to now continue to build the report and do her work. So from statistical purposes, it's clear, there's a trail, audit trail, that we now know that George made this request. Okay. So it's manual, I admit that, you're kind of doing double systems here, but it can be as you migrate away from that messy system, you can start to slowly use the cookbook to pick up part of that system, and then eventually you might go to this final view, which is similar to that first workflow, where there is no other request system. Everything is using the Data Cookbook, and all requests come in through the drafting stage and proceed through a systematic workflow. Different, looks different, but there is no other external ticketing system in use. So I think I want to step back and at the higher level talk about why spec workflows are usually more complicated than definition workflows. And it's because there's actually 3 processes included in this. It's a 3-for-1. You've got that request process, so you're trying to manage that and design for that, either trying to mimic your current environment or trying to transition to a new way to create a request process. The build, so you may have build across multiple departments. There's just a lot of varieties of who is building a report and where they are positioned. And then the last process is the approval. Who should approve it? Should the requester approve it? Should a governance group approve it? Should a centralized IR kind of situation approve it? So it's kind of, as you think through what you want in your workflow, separate it into these 3 sub-processes. See if that doesn't help you clarify what you want to do in your own workflow. You can have multiple stages for each one. It's not like a stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. It doesn't have to be that rigid. But I think if you just conceptually think of these processes, it'll help you clarify what you want in your own workflow. Okay, kind of then to summarize some other design features. Some of these I will have covered already in the talk. We talked about the workflow panel and how you can view those stage names and transition actions, and the need to be mindful of, are they clear? Are your participants going to understand what to do? Conditionals, we talked about that. And I showed you an example of a spec type conditional. The selection of the workflow. I touched on that, but let me illustrate that more concretely. If I go over to my list of workflows and I navigate to my subset of specification workflows, it's the order that these workflows appear on this page that's going to drive the order that they are executed in. And if you have conditionals, of course, you want those to be on the top, so that if the specification meets the conditional criteria, it hits that in the first workflow and uses it. If the specification does not meet that conditioned criteria, it moves on to the second workflow. And if there's a conditional there, it's not met, it moves on to the third, etc. So you want to be mindful of the order in which your workflows appear on this page. I have many here. Yours would not look like this. I have many here because of the demo purposes of it. If you did not have conditionals, you would probably just have 1 or 2 workflows here on your list. And then I did mention why I think spec workflows are just a little more complicated. It's because there's 3 processes. So a couple other design features. Workflows is a kind of a common misperception. Workflows are automatically assigned. You build your workflows and you put them in the proper order. And then when the specification itself is created, let's go to Jill here, and if she creates a new one from scratch, she is assigned a workflow based on the one that's on the top of that list. She can't change the workflow from here. She's stuck with this. She cannot change it. If her admin went back and changed the order, that would change it. But at this point, when you create a spec, you cannot choose your workflow at this point. It's by definition that way. If you have a conditional set up, and as Jill, let's say in this example here, Jill does not trigger the conditional, and so she uses her regular spec, and then as she goes on in her build of the spec, she changes the functional area, or she changes the spec type, whatever she that triggers the conditional, then she's in the middle of the workflow. Upon triggering, she will automatically be thrown back in her workflow.
You got quieter again, Brenda.
Yeah, there. Is that better? Better?
No, not yet.
Yeah. Better? No? No?
I think that's better, yeah.
Ooh. How's that?
Keep talking.
Better?
Yeah, I think that's good enough. That's
Okay. So you will automatically, Jill will automatically be thrown back to the very beginning stage of the conditioned workflow. So that can be a little disarming. Suddenly you're thrown back to the beginning of something, and it's because you hit a conditional trigger. The last piece is around collaboration, and I do want to show that. Let's log in. I'm going to swap out my login real quick here to Sally. Sally's going to log in. Sorry, her name is Sally Admin. Conditional is a way to bring somebody in the middle of a workflow for just kind of some triage. Enrollment status, international students. So Sally's in the middle of this workflow, this spec of enrollment status, international students. And let's say Peter is a colleague and she wants to ask Peter something specifically about this data. She doesn't want Peter involved in the whole workflow. Peter doesn't want to be involved in the whole workflow scene, but he's willing to be called in as needed. Sally can ask for Peter. This is your list of all your cookbooks, of all your users. Here's Peter. And she can specify how she wants Peter to participate. Peter can comment and not change a thing on her spec. She can give Peter the edit permission, and he could actually physically make changes to the spec. Or she could delegate her entire role. Basically says, Peter, do my job for this specification within this workflow. And then that would let Peter continue to interact with the transition actions just through that stage. So it's just a way, I think sometimes when people, you want that flexibility sometimes to just bring in somebody on a case-by-case basis. You don't want to burden them with the whole scene 24/7, but you can bring them in to play a role. Okay. In collaboration, this collaborator feature is set at the step level. It's a step feature. And we talked about multiple happy paths. So let's say the scenario is you've got a workflow, you've had it for 1.5 years, and now you want to change it. And you've got maybe 10 specifications that are currently in flight in your current workflow. My best advice would be try and get them out of there, get them to the approved state. If you can't, and if there are some open there and you create your new workflow and you activate it and start using your second workflow, those other objects will continue to move forward without any problems. It'll still work exactly as it did before you created a second version of your workflow. It just can be confusing to the participants in the workflow who now have to kind of deal in two parallel systems. So you want to exit that first workflow as cleanly and as thoroughly as you can to avoid confusion. The cookbook itself will continue to work and operate normally. As soon as you activate your second workflow, every specification created will begin utilizing that new workflow. So what can you do? What will trigger the need to version a new workflow? If you want to add a new stage, and I call it anything that architecturally changes the workflow, adding a stage, adding a step, changing the any-all feature within a step, changing the entry point or override within a transition action. I went over entry point and override in a lot of detail in the definition workflow webinar. And of course, adding a conditional will architecturally change your workflow. If you want to make any of those changes, you're looking at a new version. There's a lot that you can change that doesn't trigger a new version. I call these kind of the descriptive labeling features. You can change the name of a transition action, of a stage, of a step. So all that information that in your workflow panel, if you're not substantively changing the process itself, you can change these labels without having to trigger a new version. You can change the labels on these buttons. Just don't change substantively what the buttons do. So that's helpful, and you can kind of clean up some awkwardness, some inadvertent awkwardness sometimes without any pain. You can also swap out user groups. Or swap out the assignments. So if you want to go from assignment mapping to a simple user group, whatever, you can make those swaps without disturbing your workflow. And then, of course, you can change users within the user groups that you've consumed and the named role assignment mapping groups. Of course, you can just swap out names. Very transparently swap in Lisa for Peter